Hello, my name is Eric Strauss, and I live in Arcadia, California, and I'm running for president in the year 2024. I'll probably begin campaigning in earnest around the time of the inauguration after the 2020 election in early 2021. I've made a series of these videos, political videos, and this one's a little bit different than the previous ones in that I've, I'm not talking about a specific issue. So, in that regard, I'm talking about a larger issue or kind of an agenda. And I've put it out here on this document, this notepad document, so I can stay on track here into what I want to discuss. So, first, what I'd like to talk about is how we talk about politics in America and the status quo, specifically how we talk about politicians in the status quo. So, there's three main frames that people use when talking about politicians. Either they talk about the person, this person's a leader, a visionary, an elite, an ideologue, a puppet or a puppet master. Um, that would be more, maybe that's part of motivation, I don't know. About the motivation, politicians can be called cronies, fat cats, windbags, apologists, or stooges, serving the interests of corporations or of their particular interest group or of their constituency. Or people can frame politicians about the work. This person's a policy wonk, is a term that you don't really hear much anymore. It used to be fairly common. A spin doctor, just trying to spin narratives rather than actually deal with stuff. Or a bureaucrat, somebody who's not really questioning any of the agenda issues, who's just doing the work of the government, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on people's perspective. Policy frames in the status quo are different than frames about politicians, which is to say, this is how, in general, we talk about public policy. And it's basically how public policy can be thought about. There's three main frames: individualistic, communitarian, and personal. An individualistic frame, it focuses more on limited government, rights, autonomy, process integrity, and it defaults towards negating, not doing things, rather than doing things. A communitarian frame typically associates with responsibilities, more than rights, interconnectedness, outcome integrity, and defaults towards doing things. Whether or not we ought to default towards doing things or not doing things sort of depends on what kind of policy issue we're talking about, and it can depend on certain elements of a what's called an impact calculus. So, if we're going to meaningfully talk about the impacts of public policy, we need to consider at least three factors, as I say: magnitude, time frame, and probability. Um, Personal policy frames, there are two. One says that policy correctness links to personal benefit, and this is the assumption of the rational voter hypothesis. The rational voter hypothesis says that people vote in their own interest. That if a if a tax is going to tax you, like if you're a smoker and there's a proposition that raises the taxes on cigarettes, then you're going to vote no on that because you have a personal interest in it. In that instance, the rational voter hypothesis is almost certainly correct, but generally, it probably isn't. Policy correctness linked to the conflation of meaning and being is what assumes the expressive voter um, hypothesis, which says that people vote for things because they've identified as part of their being an agreement with certain statements about politics. And so if I know that I am somebody who votes to remedy poverty, then I'm going to not consider whether a given policy impacts me personally or how much it impacts me personally, if it doesn't impact me personally dramatically anyway. And I'm going to instead check against whether it's voting meh or meh is consistent with my own identity as I understand it. Studies tend to suggest that the latter of the two personal frames is a more accurate descriptive frame for how people vote, namely that people vote as an expressive act rather than an act of interest, personal interest, or rationality, so to speak. And of course, the rational voter hypothesis assumes that personal interest is rational, is what we'd call a utilitarian kind of frame of rationalism. that because we can know what is prescriptively best for us more easily than we can know what is normatively true, or at least we can apply what is prescriptively best for us more easily, that rationality always serves one's own interests. But it doesn't necessarily. There's another kind of rationality that says it's principled restraint that would not necessarily link to personal benefit at all. There's plenty of times where I voted, for example, when I lived in Temple City, I voted against a property tax increase, even though I didn't own any property. Now, you could say, well, I was indirectly voting in my interest because my landlord might have raised my rent in order to compensate for his increased property tax, but that's not why I voted against it. I voted against it for reasons associated to the expressive voter hypothesis. Namely, I didn't think I wanted to be a party to taxing people other than myself for a common purpose that I no longer even accessed, namely the school system. So my daughter, by the time that bill came out, was almost out of high school, or soon enough would no longer access. The property tax was going to go to building new facilities for the schools in Temple City. So I voted no on it because of a couple of reasons. One, I just generally thought there was nothing wrong with the facilities they had. They were certainly adequate. Number two, as I said, I didn't consider it appropriate for me to vote to tax other people to provide a service I wasn't even going to use. So, so I voted no on it. Understanding meta-analysis. So this video hopes to make fairly straightforward how I'm different from other politicians and why you should vote for me. And it's because I think about public policy in a more correct and nuanced way than other politicians do generally. And that requires some meta-analysis. Now, I've been critiqued by some people before saying, your meta approach, Eric, is never going to work. You're never going to connect people with this. Well, maybe not, but it's part of my general presentation, and something I want to go over. So it may not be an effective way to connect with the vast populace of people, but I need to get the people who are most equipped to understand exactly why I really am the best choice for president to understand why I'm the best choice. And as I broaden the range of my discourse, I'll obviously need to work hard to make sure that complicated ideas that I want to express are expressed in simple ways that people can understand and internalize. So, meta-analysis is different than analysis. An analysis example is, what should we do about immigration? And you can provide lots of different reasons and various justifications for your affirmation or negation or whatever. A meta-analysis example is, how and why do people affirm statements A through Z regarding immigration? What comprises desirable results? What's implied as a frame, in other words, by a given affirmation? So if I say, well, we should build a wall between Mexico and the United States, one implied frame is that it is good to control the border. Now, you may or may not agree with a given immigration policy, but you probably do agree with the implied frame that if we're going to have borders, we should control them. Whether or not building a wall is a good idea is another question, The thing is, there's the implied frame, and then there's the explicit policy. And the explicit policy may also express other implied frames that may be more important to you. For example, building a wall also expresses an implied frame, we don't want you Mexicans here. So some people are going to say that's the predominant implied frame, and some people are going to say controlling the borders is the predominant implied frame. And the people who say, no, you really just don't want the Mexicans here, are going to discount the legitimacy of the border control frame. The border control people are going to discount the legitimacy of the ontological frame, namely that this suggests we don't want Mexicans here or something. And there's going to be little common ground to be found on the subject as a consequence. Not because people can't communicate meaningfully within the frame, but because people can't communicate meaningfully about the frame, or at least are not habituated to doing so. So, all right, next. What comprises desirable approaches to affirmation and negation in general is the fundamental meta-analysis question that I'm asking as an individual human being and as a politician and as a future president of the United States. I do understand that people need to be able to put me in a box. People need to understand somebody, to a certain extent, to put them in a box. That when you understand that I'm a man, for example, some of that experience of understanding me as a man involves severing part of my complete individual whole and reducing me to a member of a group. There are ways in which we have to do some of this in life as heuristics to grasp things. We have to abandon the complete understanding in favor of a real understanding. In other words, to understand everything is to understand nothing to some extent, because things need to have a point. So let's put me in a box and make me have a point. Some labels that people can use to describe me that I think are correct and hopefully positive. Statesman. I don't want to be known as a leader necessarily, although I believe I have good leadership skills. I don't want to be known as a visionary, although I believe my vision is great. I want to be known as a statesman because it's the appropriate term for the leader of a citizen democracy. And it subsumes all the skills that I bring to the table. You can call me a patriotic pragmatist. The pragmatist part would suggest that I'm here in the communitarian area, that I'm willing to use utilitarianism and outcome justifications for public policies. But the patriotic part would suggest that I'm in some sense constrained by ontology or principle, individualistic or personal. Now, I will tell you, I will not bring my own personal interests into any public matter when I'm president. I consider that absolutely inappropriate. So I would never do that. But I'm a patriot in the sense that I accept and even embrace the idea of nationalism. That the fact that the world is comprised of nation states means we have to treat it as though it's comprised of nation states. And being president of a nation means being a patriot first and foremost. If I'm qualified to be president of the United States, I damn well better be a patriotic American. And I am. It makes me emotional. I'm process driven, which means I understand that if we apply the right processes in general, we'll have the right conclusions in general. That doesn't mean I'm an ideologue or have an agenda. It means that, we put it this way. We can think of the world with this individualistic and communitarian frame break as sports versus school. So both sports and school need to have fair rules that apply to everybody equally. In sports, if one team just demolishes another team and wins 75-0, then we don't go, the sport is wrong, the sport is broken, the rules are wrong. We go, that's just how it is. It's a purely competitive endeavor. It's zero sum. For one team to win, another team needs to lose. For the game to work, the rules have to be applied consistently, even when on occasion you get a very lopsided result. We don't change the rules just because that happens. We understand that's a necessary occurrence in the display of data over time. However, in school, if we see an individual who's continually failing, it is correct to think that the school is doing something wrong. After all, the child's being forced to go there to purportedly better themselves or learn stuff. And if they aren't in fact learning stuff, then perhaps they shouldn't be forced to go to that school, or perhaps the school is doing a bad job. And that's more of a responsibility understanding of things and an interconnectedness understanding. That the job of education ultimately is to allow individual human beings to manifest their optimal selves and to be fully realized to the extent that is appropriate for them. We can't try to force people to be something that they're not and think something good is going to happen as a consequence. Agendas, therefore, should be specific with measurable success criteria. So I'm not saying My agenda is to promote rights. My agenda is to. I'm saying, for example, I do have a specific agenda that I can name, which is I would like to save the Salton Sea here in California, make it a national wetlands kind of thing, or national park, and put a desalination plant next to it and return it to the state of salinity that it had in the 1940s, when it was one of the premier saltwater fishing destinations in the entire world and supported massive migrations year in and year out of waterfowl who had a theretofore non-existent big freshwater, not fresh, but water source in the middle of the desert. The Salton Sea was man-made originally, but because human beings have altered the environment so much, the environmental benefits, as well as the recreational benefits and other community benefits of simply desalinating the Salton Sea down to the level it was in the 1940s, and periodically pumping some more fresh water in there so that it stays at its current height level, so vastly outweigh the costs that it makes absolute sense to do it for so many reasons. Whether you live in California or not, the benefits are not just to California. It's like if you care about stocks of, say, waterfowl that you hunt, those populations are going to be bolstered by this. Whatever your particular concern is, there's good reason to think that this is a sensible way that the federal government should actually spend money and do stuff. It's very concrete. It's not subject to mission creep. And that's something that is part of being a process-driven person, is I don't want mission creep. If you have an agenda, we're here to attain social justice or something, you will not have any meaningful policies, and you will necessarily have your agenda creep into policy matters that should be concluded on their specifics. So one of my process-driven approaches is going to be specifically, unless precluded by principle, render divisive issues moot. What does that mean? Well, for example, abortion. My position on it is it should be up to the states. There's absolutely no reason to conclude that the Supreme Court made the right decision in Roe v. Wade, because they created a right to privacy that doesn't exist. That's not to say that society shouldn't respect people's privacy. What I'm saying is that a right is a duty, a universal duty that everybody else has towards you. So when I say I have the right not to be stabbed in the chest, a right to bodily integrity, that means you have a duty not to stab me in the chest. Privacy can't be a right, because if I have a right to privacy, then you have a duty to go away when I say I don't want you near me. But that's clearly not the case. You have a reasonable expectation of privacy in private spots, and not a reasonable expectation of privacy in public spots. So it's clearly not a right. The Supreme Court, therefore, made a mistake in saying that women have the right to an abortion because it's part of a right to privacy. That's fundamentally wrong, because even if they do have a right to an abortion, that's not why. So the thing is, the federal government should not have incorporated as a federal matter this created non-right, and they should have allowed it to play out as it naturally would have, as it's supposed to, with each state setting its own policy regarding the matter. Now, note how this makes neither side of the debate happy. The pro-life people say, well, you're not caring about the children who are being killed. The pro-choice people say, but you're not caring about the women in states who don't have access to abortions. My point is, and you're not caring about my job as the president, our job as a society, and rule of law. State sovereignty is the rule of law in the United States. Your government is your state government. The federal government is the government of the government. An executive is not a legislator. So if you ask me, well, what policies will I implement? What's my big plan? Am I going to fix healthcare? Am I going to? I'm not in Congress. I'm not running for Congress. or Senate. I don't make legislation. Now, I don't mean to be disingenuous here. Obviously, if the president comes in with a clear plan, suggests it to Congress, can influence Congress members to get that, brought off the table and debated on the floor, and affirmed by both the Congress and Senate, then a president can meaningfully influence what legislation is created and passes, as Obama did with Obamacare. But Obamacare is exactly the sort of thing that I am opposed to. Not because I don't like Obamacare specifically, although I don't. In other words, I don't think it's a good approach to it, but because it tries to tackle too large of an issue. It's not specific enough, and it's agenda driven. So, for example, if you were serious about healthcare reform, and you were going to embrace the idea of an individual mandate, fine, okay, then you mandate people buy health insurance, and you would highly structure it to encourage high deductible, catastrophic health insurance plans. Because the real problem was free riders. What do you do if people don't have health insurance and they get sick? They go to the hospital. The hospital's not going to turn them away. How do we deal with this challenging economic reality? Well, the answer is the same way we do with car insurance. You compel people to get basic liability insurance. That's what catastrophic health care is. Basic liability insurance for healthcare. So it actually answers the fundamental problem that's driving the healthcare crisis. Instead, we get a massive bill that does the exact opposite. It precludes that kind of healthcare plan. It precludes the kind of healthcare plan that would actually solve the problem. So that's what it comes when you try to bite off more than you can chew. And Obamacare does a lot of stuff. The ACA does a lot of stuff. And it does a lot of stuff that, frankly, ignores principled constraints on the federal government entirely. The idea that people can be taxed for doing nothing, which, remember, the Supreme Court has ruled the individual mandate is a tax, not a penalty, it sets a bad precedent. The government should not be able to tax you for doing nothing. If they want to tax your commercial exchanges, they do. Okay, well, you're doing something. They want to tax you for owning property. Well, it's like it seems questionable that people would be taxed for owning property, but at least it's limited just to physical real estate. You don't get taxed on your car for owning it. It seems strange that you'd be taxed on your income, but it's constitutional. There's an amendment that justifies it. And at least you are doing something. Seems strange that you'd be taxed for being productive, but okay. The problem with the individual mandate is you are taxed for nothing. Doing nothing gets you a tax. And that's a problem. They're saying if, in fact, you don't get health insurance, you're getting a tax. Doesn't make any sense. A penalty, that would make sense, but then that would be unconstitutional. So the problem with Obamacare fundamentally is that it overreaches the jurisdictional scope of the federal government. But regardless, what I'm trying to get across here is avoiding mission creep means not trying to solve the healthcare crisis. It means trying to solve the free rider crisis. And if you do that, then you don't end up with something that causes the exact opposite impact. All right, so it's important to remember then that an executive is not a legislator, and that many of these divisive issues can be rendered moot. It's going to mean that neither side gets to win the agenda battle, and we all get to win the reality battle. So the U.S. federal government has well-defined limits to the scope of its authority, and state sovereignty is not a libertarian agenda. Libertarianism is about individuals not being governed very much, right? To the extent that the government that governs best governs least. I'm not saying that. I am not. Don't try to box me as a libertarian. I do believe in government, and I believe in the citizen democracy. I believe also that I'm a citizen of California, and that the vast majority of the state sovereignty kind of stuff that impacts me is from my state government. And that to the extent that the federal government is involved in my life, um, it should be to constrain my state and direct my state and so forth, and that it should be for matters of national concern, defense, highways, national parks, environmental protection, foreign policy, that the federal government should not be involved in whether or not I buy health insurance. Now, however, being a pragmatist also means if there were a bill put in front of me that I thought meaningfully solved the healthcare crisis, even if it were a single payer or socialist kind of thing, if somehow it were written well enough and successfully enough, addressed all the issues that I believed it would meaningfully improve millions of Americans' lives for the long term, I would sign it. That's what it means to be a pragmatist. And of course, I'd have to explain exactly why, in this instance, this was the correct thing to do. As I will with every single one of my actions as president. I will explain to you exactly why I took the action. You will have every opportunity to explain why I'm wrong. I am not, unlike President Trump, interested in limiting your ability to engage discursively and meaningfully with the policy execution that I, as an executive representing my constituency of hundreds of millions of Americans, has does. I need to. I must. Every president should and must justify to their constituency why they are taking the actions they are taking. And any president worth voting for is going to be somebody who is honest. I am indisputably an extremely honest person. I'm not a liar, and I don't play fast and loose with the truth either. Like, I'm not kind of a liar. I'm not a spin doctor. I have successfully done the meta-analysis to say, here's my metaphysician diagnosis of the problem. This is the discursive breakdown. Here's the not middle ground, but the mooting ground, ideally. I don't want to split the difference. Splitting the difference is generally never a good heuristic. Occasionally it turns out to be the right thing to do, and the sort of clock right twice a day. But no, it's not, let's compromise and find the middle ground. That's a wrong approach as well. Let's not have an agenda-driven approach. Let's actually take the correct, best course of action on every given issue as it arises. And let's be transparent and fully inclusive of everybody in the discussion as to whether I made a good choice or not. I'm not here to be defensive as president, right? And say, no, everything I'm doing is right. I'm not going to be a perfect president. I might make some mistakes. Instead of avoiding critique, I want to hear it. Instead of avoiding the arguments of those who think I'm doing a bad job, I want to answer them. And if you are right, I will admit I made a mistake on this one. I will do my best to remedy it right now. I will explain why the mistake was made and what my thinking was and what I've learned from it. So perhaps the best label you could put on me is a long-term frame visionary idealist. I ultimately believe that the greatest impact I will have as president of the United States is on the way people talk about politics going forward. That if we can make a topic of conversation how we talk about politics, make that meaningfully a topic of conversation. How is it that we determine what's a good policy and what's a bad policy? How do we determine whether something works well or not? How do we determine whether a person's a good candidate for a given public office? Should we be putting so much emphasis on our own instincts regarding whether they're on our team or not, which seems to be the general common approach we're taking in the status quo. So I represent a meaningful alternative to that. And as far as I can tell, I represent the only meaningful alternative to that is can legitimately have even the remotest possible chance of becoming president of the United States. I'm qualified on a number of different levels, but first and foremost, remember this. I am a pragmatic, patriot and a long frame visionary idealist. I'm not easily fooled by anybody. I'm not subject to being corrupted. I am not money driven, and I'm not power driven. I probably only want to serve one term. I'm a true patriot who believes that America has always been the greatest citizen democracy in the world, and to watch it crumble before my eyes is a tragedy I just can't sit on the sidelines and do nothing about. So, thanks for watching, and God bless America.